You're watching Strat News Global. I'm Amitabh Brevi. And in Canberra is Dr. Malcolm Davis. He's a senior analyst with ASPI, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. Dr. Davis, thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure.
Dr. Davis, it's been an interesting, to say the least, week, if not months and years, in terms of the tension between Australia and China. But it's being seen around the globe. I mean, of course, but in the globe as an important example of a country standing up to China and possibly the repercussions.
Look, I think that's exactly right. Clearly, China is trying to make an example of us. Their goal is to make us, and I borrow a phrase here from the TV series Game of Thrones, to bend the knee to Beijing. They essentially want us to be accommodating and compliant and recognize their rise and not stand in the way, and certainly not be critical of China. And part of that process is coercion. It's about placing pressure on us through economic boycotts and economic tariffs. It's about wolf warrior diplomacy against us to try and get us into a place whereby we feel we have to back down. And if they can do that, which they won't succeed, but if they could do that, then smaller countries in the region will be more quick to bend the knee to Beijing. So this is part of a long-term strategy for them to assert their leadership and their dominance over the region as a hegemonic power, and to isolate us from the United States and make us more vulnerable. And we're certainly not going to back down.
I'm just going to take up your last point, but since you mentioned the US, and China has been known to do this, whether it's to drive wedges in partnerships, in alliances. I mean, even in ASEAN, we've seen how they know how to go for the weakest link. How are you so confident that the Australian government will, not bend the knee?
Well, look, I think that what the Chinese are banking on is pressure from within. From the business community, from elements within the political community and the university sector, to try and convince the Australian government to back down. But we're not going to do that because nothing we've done or said is inappropriate or aggressive. In contrast, we've tried our best to maintain a good relationship with China. We see the trading relationship as very important, but we're certainly not going to sacrifice our values and our national interests just to preserve that important relationship. So we have been talking in past months about how to decouple from to diversify our trading relationships, and our relationship with the United States is first and foremost above all things. It is the most important relationship, even more so than China. So I think that the Chinese hate that, and what they want to do is split us with the United States and get us ultimately to align with China, or at the very least, accommodate China. And I think we're not going to do this.
And it's been a consistent policy for over a year. I mean, it started off possibly last year with the barring of Huawei. Then you had the calls for a probe for the origins of the coronavirus. It's subsequently snowballed as well. I mean, there are investigations into foreign interference. There's now a federal law, which I think still has a technical passing to do, which can say, bar what Victoria did in terms of the Belt and Road Initiative. So it is a completely consistent policy over the months and years, at least a year and a half. Why has Australia chosen that path in comparison to what it was doing before?
I think we look at what China is doing under Xi Jinping and compare it to previous leaders, Hu Jintao, Jiang Zemin, and we see a very different China with a very different agenda. No longer content to hide their strength and bide their time, as Deng Xiaoping would have said. Xi is very much focused on the China dream of a rejuvenated China that once again is the Middle Kingdom, and once again is the dominant power in the Indo-Pacific region. We would prefer China to keep on rising, but to rise as a cooperative power that works within the established rules-based international order, that works with the United States as equals and respects international law, in particularly doesn't claim territory that is not Chinese. So I'm thinking here very much of the South China Sea, and I'm also thinking very much about Taiwan's future. The Taiwanese people do not see themselves as part of China, but the Chinese are determined to force Taiwan out of China, whether the Taiwanese people want it or not. And we don't support that. So we are concerned about where China is headed in terms of becoming an aggressive hegemonic power. We don't want to see the region become dominated by a sinosphere controlled from Beijing. But we are starting to push back, and we have been pushing back for some time. And our concerns about Huawei were quite justified because of the nature of the technology could have given China a huge control over a critical infrastructure here in Australia. And I think that we've gone from there to a quite legitimate request that we do an independent international investigation into the origins of the COVID-19 virus. And China hates being challenged. So this is where this tension is coming from. We're standing up to China. China wants states to be put in their place.
Well, it's important that you get international support in what you're doing. I mean, any country doing it alone is probably going to have a very tough time, if not fail. There have been international voices, I mean, across the world, whether it's Germany, whether it's UK, even the Biden administration nominee for the NSA, Sullivan, has also spoken out in that. Do you think that the international community is standing up where it's needed to in terms of supporting Australia?
I think it is. I think in the United States, there's broad bipartisan consensus in terms of the perspective on China and what its intentions are. And certainly there's no suggestion whatsoever that Biden will back away from standing up to China. I think that if anything, it'll be more effective because Biden is going to reassert multilateralism in the region, and that's really critical to counterbalance China's power. I think within the broader Five Eyes community, UK, US, Canada, New Zealand, there's broad consensus and broad support for Australia's position there. And I think outside of Five Eyes, you're seeing countries like Japan, India, Germany, France, all supporting Australia. So the major powers all recognise the challenge that China faces, and they are broadly supportive of Australia's position. And certainly we don't feel concerned that we would be left isolated in this particular crisis.
Dr. Davis, you talked about how the Chinese were trying to drive a wedge, so as to speak, in terms of the Australian business community or what they have to gain. What about the internal politics? I mean, the Prime Minister's called what the opposition leader has said as disappointing but not surprising. Is there bipartisan support for what Australia's foreign policy is within Australia?
Look, my own personal perspective is that the opposition leader miscalculated in his approach. But that's the nature of Australian politics. We're a democracy.
And politics everywhere.
And politics everywhere. And we're a democracy. And we have freedom of speech. We have freedom of thought. And we have a free and open parliament. This is completely the opposite of what we're seeing in China, which is an authoritarian dictatorship. So, we do recognize that there is always the possibility that there will be debate, a free and open debate within our society on key issues. And we welcome that. And that debate certainly shouldn't be silenced. My personal perspective is I think that the opposition leader was wrong in making the calls that he did, but he's the opposition leader. He's got the right to decide his party's policy.
And free and open debate is important because it's being attempted to be turned around by the Chinese state, the CCP. When you talk about, the Australian investigation into alleged atrocities by soldiers in Afghanistan and how, the Foreign Ministry deputy spokesperson tweeted that, which raised the latest furor, they're diverting attention from, their human rights issues, whether it's in Xinjiang, whether it's in Tibet, of course, Hong Kong, Taiwan is a separate issue. Yep. And do you think they are being successful in that, at least in social media?
look, it might be a tactical success for the short term, but in reality, everyone understands what the Chinese are doing in Xinjiang province. It's a form of cultural holocaust, where you do have large numbers of people, over 1 million people, locked up in so-called education camps, which are more like concentration camps, simply because they're Muslim. The world needs to stand up and say something about that. At the end of the Second World War, when we understood what the Nazis had done with the Jewish population, with the final solution, we said never again. Well, the risk is that if we don't stand up to this, there will be the potential for another disaster of that scale. So I think that it's really critical that the international community confront China and take it to task on Xinjiang and on Tibet. And I do think that we need to take them to task on Hong Kong as well, and stand firm and deter China from taking any actions against Taiwan, because there is the terrible risk that if we simply do nothing, that more and more people will find out that they end up in some sort of re-education facility in some isolated spot, simply because of whom they are or their beliefs.
So what's the necessity then for this legislation that is almost passed now for, barring foreign, the Belt and Road projects? I would think that the Victorian example is one of them. Is it retrospective? I beg your pardon. Does the government see states continuing to have engagement, economic or otherwise, with China? Why is the need for that legislation?
I think because we recognise the risks that the Victorian deal with China created in terms of the potential for China to gain a foothold in a manner that would enable it to control critical infrastructure and to influence policy in a manner that was inappropriate. So I think this new legislation being passed by Parliament is really a positive step. I think that the federal government now needs to act swiftly to tear up the Belt and Road Initiative deal with Victoria and China. I do think they also need to look at other aspects of Australia's state relations with China. So, the one thing that leaps out at me, for example, is China's 99-year lease on Darwin Port. That needs to be revisited. And same with other critical infrastructure deals that have been made by states with China. So I think this is a very important step by the Australian government that will enable the Australian government to take back control and prevent China from essentially undertaking a divide and conquer approach whereby they do deals with individual states and weaken the influence and the control of the federal government. We can't allow that to happen.
Another important step that was taken in the military dimension, or at least in signaling, was the Quad, and India inviting Australia's Navy again for the Malabar exercises. How important do you see that? Because there was a lot of prevarication on the Indian establishment side because of what it had seen Australia doing in the past vis-a-vis China.
Look, I think that once again, we're a democracy. We had a policy then which I think was flawed. The then Rudd government made a terrible mistaken judgment that the Quad shouldn't proceed because they didn't want to antagonize Beijing. I think that was then. This is now. Time moved on, and we're facing a much more threatening environment. And I do think that the resuscitation or the re-emergence of the Quad and Australia's participation in the Malabar exercises are a very step forward for Australia-India relations, and they are a good basis to proceed forward going into the future to develop even closer defence and foreign policy relations, including the sorts of reciprocal access agreements that we've just signed with Japan. Those are the next steps, in my opinion, that we should be looking at with India, a reciprocal access agreement with India that would enable our forces to have much closer access to Indian facilities and Indian forces to stage out of Australian facilities. That would be a very positive step going forward.
Dr. Malcolm Davis, absolutely appreciate your analysis and your time.
My pleasure.
And do log on to our website, Stat News Global. You can support our kind of journalism there as well, and follow our social media handles on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. You've been watching Stat News Global. I'm Amitabh Brevi.